Hey guys, this is Kevin Cam with Precision Powerlifting Systems. This is like the 9th time we've tried to do this video. Battling some rain, some wind, and some Jay Birdie camera mishaps. So hopefully this time actually works out. So today what I want to talk about is the max effort method and how Precision Powerlifting Systems, how we utilize it in our training. I think when you talk to most coaches, I'm gonna let the FedEx truck go by here. When you talk to most coaches, I don't think any coach will argue that specificity is important. Now, when we define specificity for powerlifting, how I define it is you're gonna have a lift within the rules of competition, a squat, a bench press, and a deadlift. So a squat to depth, bench press where you touch your chest, slight pause, press, and then a deadlift that you fully lock out, knees long, shoulders behind the bar. Those are our competition lifts. Now we can vary those lifts quite a bit, but anything that's done to a 1 rep max of those lifts is very specific to the sport of powerlifting. I think the definition of specificity amongst coaches changed, and I think it changed relatively recently, where it's become more, you're always in the same positions and it's just squatting, benching, and deadlifting. It's the actual movement that became specific and not the actual movement plus the load. So how I define specificity for the sport of powerlifting is doing a lift that's very close to the competition lifts within the rules of the competition lifts for a heavy single. And again, I don't think any coach is going to argue that specificity is not important. So if you look at a lot of the powerlifting programs now, and even where I started, it's a lot of sub-max technique work, high volume. For some reason, the max effort method kind of went away. Like Westside was doing it and made it popular. But if you look at like weightlifting cultures, it's been pretty popular amongst multiple weightlifting systems. So you had the Bulgarians and the Greeks, which I think are most famous for their heavy singles. But what people forget is the Russians actually use a lot of heavier lifts too. So if you look at papers done by Zatsiorsky, he compared the Bulgarian and the Russian systems. And one of the things that he found, and this is very interesting, is the Russians use a competitive max when they're using their percentages, and the Bulgarians will use a training max when they're using their percentages. So the difference between the competitive max and the training max might be the difference in what people think for the intensity of the actual programs. So the Russians are using a higher number for that training percentage than the Bulgarians. So at the end of the day, they might be using very, very similar numbers. I think when you look at the two systems too, you need to look, one, the Bulgarians, it's a small country, and they specifically will pick people that have the right height, the right skill set. So they have this program of very limited exercises, and they pick the people to do this program with, and it had fantastic success. But the Soviet Union's a much larger country with a lot more variation within their population. So they needed more variation within the lifts themselves. So that's where you'll see the difference, where the Bulgarians, I believe, used 6 lifts and the Russians used, I think, over 40 in their variations. Now, again, this is weightlifting. This isn't powerlifting, but the majority of the history of the sport comes from weightlifting. Powerlifting is still a relatively new sport. So when you look at weightlifting and then you look at powerlifting, weightlifting is fast power. Those movements are done explosively. It's that speed strength. Right? I think the average, I don't even want to recite the numbers. I'd have to go back and actually look. But the lifts, the clean and jerk and the snatch are much faster lifts than the squat, the bench, and the deadlift in powerlifting. So that difference in speed needs to be taken into consideration when we start taking into consideration the intensity of the lifts. So where weightlifting is more of a speed strength sport, you're going to have more weights, more repetitions in those lighter weight zones, that 70 to 80% zone. But with powerlifting, it's slow power. So basically, light weights move fast, heavy weights move slow. So most people are going to squat and deadlift a lot more than they're going to clean and snatch. It's just how it works. So with the heavier weights, we have slower movements. So we don't necessarily need to be using ultra light weights to move quickly in order to improve our 1RM. It's a different sport. Now, I'm not saying that there isn't benefits to doing that stuff, because in terms of technical efficiency and repetition practice, that's important, because doing that stuff's better than doing nothing, and you can't really just max out all of the time. So when you're comparing the two, powerlifting should use more heavier weights. So more weights at that 85% of 1RM or higher, because it's more specific to the sport. Now, I think almost everybody will agree that if you try to lift above 90% for, Sheiko would say 3 weeks. I believe Louis Simmons says 3 weeks. I believe most of the textbooks that you read are going to say around that 3 to 4 week mark. You're going to start to see diminishing returns. So not only will progress halt, but in a lot of cases you'll see progress start rolling backwards. So one of the things that Louis Simmons talks about and how he allows his lifters to max out more frequently is just utilizing more variation within the lifts. So they do a max effort lower on day 1, max effort upper day 2. However, each week they rotate a different exercise. And so the lower exercise is squat and deadlifts, and they'll use some variation. So that'll rotate through, and then it'll be some pressing variation on the other day. And then they use really light weights on the other days of the week. So it's really heavy days, low volume, really light days, moderate to higher volume. There's very little done in those mid-range weights. Now those mid-range weights, I think, and I'm not a weightlifting coach by any means, so take this for what it's worth, but those mid-range weights might be more beneficial to a weightlifter because of the speed of the movement. So those mid-range weights are still going to be able to move relatively quick, and it's a heavy enough load where it's going to challenge your technique under those heavier loads. In terms of powerlifting, that 80 to 90 range might not have as big of a role in creating maximal levels of strength. And one of the reasons is, I'm going to use Charlie Francis as an example here. So he uses a high-low approach of sprinting and basically says those middle ranges should always be avoided. And his argument for those middle ranges is they require a lot of recovery for not the most amount of stimulus for adaptation. So if we're using those 80 to 90% a lot, it's going to require a good amount of recovery, but it's not going to be as optimal for improving performance as if we were pushing those, and I'm going to say like 95 to 100%, but even 85% or greater, even though there's some overlap with those numbers there, getting up into those more maximal singles. If the other argument against the max singles is it's always a technique thing, like, oh, your technique breaks down against with max weights, and that is true, and there is efficacy to that, but the problem with that is, as a coach, you need to practice the technique with those heavier weights. If you're just constantly using those middle range or lighter weights all of the time, the transference of that technique to heavier weights, in my experiences, is just not there. So if you want to improve the intermuscular and the intramuscular coordination the most, you need to be lifting at or near maximum. Literally, you can't even argue that that's not more beneficial. So if we want, basically, so Dr. Squat had said this, the one who can initiate the most motor units the quickest will have the best results. In order to do that, for that synchronization, that rate coding, that coordination, you need to be lifting heavier weights. You're just not going to get that from those lighter weights. And I think you can't throw the experiences of somebody like Louis Simmons, who's been using a lot of max attempts in his programs since the early 80s, since I was born. I don't think you can throw that stuff away.
How old are you?
Mind your business, Jess. Jess is like 45, but pretends to be 30. So if we want the physical, the technical, and the mental. So max weights cover all three. You should be lifting weights in the gym that create some type of emotional response that mimics competition. If you're getting those emotional responses for the first time at competition, powerlifting's a sport. So I'm going to just back up a little bit, because a lot of, like, when you look at these systems, the